Okay. The Carolina colony, excuse me, in Georgia are they are the last of the southern colonies we just need to mention. Now, as a whole, southern colonies are agricultural, they are rural, okay? They're different from what we talked about in New England, okay? They tended to be much more agriculturally driven. In Virginia, it was tobacco. In Maryland, it was tobacco. In North Carolina, it's going to be tobacco. But in South Carolina, it's going to be something different. So we have to kind of remember that. And also remember that we aren't talking about cotton yet. Okay? That we are talking about rice, indigo, tobacco, things that aren't necessarily what you might think would be agricultural products from the South. So today, we'll kind of take a look at these and fill in a few gaps here, okay? One of the things about the Carolina colony, okay? In the beginning, the Carolina colony starts out as just that, one colony. The Carolina colony had some ties to the West Indies. Okay? The West Indies were the major sugar producing areas in the Caribbean and places like Barbados and others, lots of sugar being produced there. 40% of Africans being exported out of Africa went into the West Indies for sugar production. So it is not only a major sugar producing area, it's also a major consumer of slaves. We talked about how slaves feed the labor production in sugar because sugar is so labor intensive. Okay? It takes a tremendous amount of labor on a plantation to deal with sugar. And so in 1670, a group of farmers who had hoped to go to the West Indies to set up their own sugar farms there, but had gotten pushed out, end up leaving the West Indies and coming to what's going to become Carolina. They brought some slaves with them, but they also brought something that the West Indies had already adopted, and that is a slave code. And I told you guys that the coming of slave codes means that slavery, institutionalized slavery, is beginning to show up and beginning to develop. Institutionalized, legalized, race-based slavery is now starting to show up. And that comes from the West Indies. It comes from areas that already had a lot of experience with using slaves as labor. And so the Carolina colony in the beginning is going to be tied to that notion of agricultural production and slavery, using slave labor. Now, when North Carolina develops, you can probably guess that, and I told you guys already, that North Carolina is going to become a major tobacco producing area. So you're going to use that slave labor to produce tobacco. But in South Carolina, the crop is going to be different, and they will have to adapt to that changing environment and that changing crop. Okay, so we'll see how slavery and slave labor really impact both of these. Okay, Carolina is technically named for Charles II. Okay, and eventually the king will grant a charter to 8 of his supporters. They become proprietors, and so the Carolina colony becomes really a proprietary colony. Now, the hope was Carolina would become kind of a way station, okay? A place where the English could distribute food, wine, other things, all right, to Barbados, and to send supplies to Barbados and other parts of the West Indies. Okay, and then they could also help in the shipping of sugar back to Europe. Okay, that was the hope, at least. Okay, that's kind of what it was established for. It's not going to develop that way. Now, remember, this is what we're talking about. Okay, North Carolina is up here. Okay, South Carolina is here. The most important feature is this. Okay, Charlestown, which of course you guys know is later going to become Charleston, right? Okay, named for Charles II. Okay, now, what do you know about Charleston? Great harbor. Okay, so it's going to become a major link in the Atlantic trade, the transatlantic trade. Okay, great harbor. Why don't you see any of that along a lot of the North Carolina coast? But no, there are parts of North Carolina's coastline that are called the graveyard of the Atlantic. Why? It's treacherous. Okay, it's not the easiest place to navigate. That's why later on it becomes a haven for pirates, because it was very difficult to navigate some of those shoals, some of those low points. Okay, if you didn't know what you were doing, you could get in trouble. Okay, so you don't see as much harbor activity up here. Now, eventually they'll get much better at it. Okay, and you'll have places like Norfolk and others in Virginia that are right up here. So you've got a lot of harbor activity. Okay, but Charleston is going to dominate really the South. It and Savannah, both will become major harbors. By the time of the Revolution, Charlestown is the fourth largest city in America, and it's a southern city. Okay, so it is behind Philadelphia. Philadelphia is the most populous. Okay, followed by New York and Boston. But then you have Charleston, way down here. Okay, which is and becomes a major city. Now, in the beginning, like we said, North Carolina and South Carolina are going to become, are going to be one colony. They're eventually going to be split. North Carolina tends more towards Virginia. South Carolina really is a little bit on its own. Okay. I'm gonna kind of go over. I just told you about Charleston. Tell you a little bit about North Carolina. Okay, gets a lot of its population from, especially northern North Carolina, gets a lot of its population from Virginia. People who didn't have enough land in Virginia, who didn't like the situation in Virginia, okay, they'll move south into North Carolina. And they tend to be a little bit more rebellious. They tend to be a little bit more hospitable to, let's say, your more ruffian type crews like pirates and other things. Okay, so North Carolina adapts a lot of the economy of Virginia. Northern North Carolina is very much a tobacco producing area. Okay, give you an example. There are two universities in North Carolina that were really within spitting distance of one another. Okay, University of North Carolina at Chapel Hill and Duke. Okay, the road between that connects those two is called what? Anybody know? Tobacco Road. Duke University was founded by the Duke family, which did what? That's right. James B. Duke invented really a cigarette rolling machine and really mass produced tobacco into what we would consider to be cigarettes today. Okay, so that's where their family fortune came from, was tobacco. So there's a long history of association with North Carolina and tobacco. Okay, so they will eventually split from South Carolina in 1712, and that's when North Carolina and South Carolina become two separate colonies. Okay, 1712. The South Carolina, though, like I told you guys, is a little bit different. Okay, you've already got Charleston. I already told you about that. But one of the major exports coming out of Charleston is this: rice. South Carolina finds that in some areas of South Carolina, there is a already growing natural strain of wild rice. American long grain wild rice, essentially, native to South Carolina. In the 1700s, rice is a delicacy. It was very difficult to get into Europe. Okay, it was really a crop that was in really high demand because there wasn't a lot of supply for it. Okay, and so South Carolinians that start to buy up land and start finding rice on this land, they realize, hey, I can make a profit if what? I can export this stuff, right? So they bought up more land, put more of these areas under cultivation. The problem is labor. Okay. How is rice farmed? Anybody know? You ever seen it? Yes, it's farmed in wet and marshy areas. So you have to get out there in these wet and marshy areas and plant it, and it has to be harvested. All right, think about it. If it's a wet, marshy area, how many tractors are you going to get out there? Zero, right? So you can't get, it has to be done by hand. Still is in a lot of areas. Okay. So you need a lot of labor. Oh boy. So what are you going to do? What are these guys going to start to do? These big landholders in South Carolina are going to start importing slaves to do the work. Now, these guys were actually pretty smart because, okay, there were parts of Africa that were rice growing areas as well. And so what did they do? They wanted to import slaves from that particular area because, one, they already knew how to farm it. And two, it seemed like a lot of the slaves that were imported from that particular area had a genetic trait, a genetic adaptation, a genetic mutation that made them more resistant to malaria. You know, like, well, what's the big deal? Think about it. What do we just say? You farm rice in what? Marshy areas. Where do mosquitoes live? Wet, marshy areas. Where do you get malaria from? Mosquitoes. Okay. So if you are importing a group of people that's already more resistant to it, that means they have a better chance of surviving. Okay. You just bring in groups that willy-nilly, then throw them out there into the fields, they're going to catch malaria, they're going to get sick, and a lot of them are going to die. So look at the graph here, okay? Oops, it'd help if I stopped at the graph. 1700. Okay, rice production is here. Okay. 70 years later, the eve of the American Revolution, rice production is there. How do you get that big of a jump? More land under cultivation, which requires what? More labor. And so you go back to this little chart right here, and you look right down here, and you find something interesting. By 1710, slaves in South Carolina were a majority. They outnumbered the white slave holders. They outnumbered the white population, the colonial population of South Carolina. So the slave population is here because you need their labor. The owning population and the colonial population, whites from Europe, from England, from other places, is down here. How do you preserve that? Okay. I told the other class yesterday, okay, that there is there are a lot of historical precedents for this. Okay. If you've taken the first part, any of you taken the first part of Western Civ or World Civ? Nobody. Okay. Well, think about this. Okay. Have you heard about, all of you have heard about the Spartans, right? Great Greek soldiers, part of the Greek mainland, okay, developed probably the most efficient and the most formidable military force in ancient world, okay. They were terrifying on the battlefield. Why? Because they developed a system where they conquered the population around them. So everybody around Sparta, the Spartans conquered, took their land away from them, and turned them into what? Slaves. So the Helot population, the slave population around Sparta, outnumbered the Spartans as much as 10, 12 to 1. So what was the Spartans' biggest fear? Slave revolts. What are the South Carolinian slaveholders? What is their biggest fear? Slave revolt. Okay. In Sparta, they created a military to deal with it. That's why the Spartan military was so good, because they always had that specter of a slave revolt looming over them. Okay. And the Helots did revolt from time to time, and they got put down by the Spartans every time, crushed by the Spartans every time because of that powerful military. So how do you think the South Carolinian slaveholders are going to deal with it? The slave codes. The laws are so harsh and so terrible that slave revolts, of course, are going to be punished with extreme brutality. Okay, there is a slave revolt. Okay, you read there was a slave revolt inside of the Stono Rebellion, and those guys revolt. They're not even trying to take over. They're trying to get out of South Carolina and get to Florida, which was Spanish territory. They're trying essentially to run away. They end up killing people along the way. Then, of course, the posse gets after them, and when they catch up to them, what happens? They kill them all. Okay, so slave revolts were terrifying. What did I tell you? What did slave codes essentially do? They made it. They put race-based slavery under the law. Okay, set up punishments for all sorts of crimes, restricted movement. Okay, and forbade education. So it becomes very difficult for a slave population to revolt without any weapons, without any education, without any ability to, a small group might rise up, but are you going to get 80% of the population to rise up? Okay, how are they going to know about it? They're so rural. Okay, how are you going to get that knowledge out there to them to revolt at such a specific time? Okay, it becomes very difficult. And of course, many of the slaves are so afraid that they won't even chance it. So one deals with it militarily, one deals with it legally, okay? Putting an entire population under its thumb. The other crop, by the way, that came out of South Carolina is indigo, okay? It comes from those flowers that you see up there. Indigo, if you done correctly, can turn into a very powerful dye, which you can guess, turns cloth, cotton cloth, other things that comes into contact with, turns it what color? Blue, okay? It was relatively cheap. It was very powerful. So a lot of workers' clothes ended up being dyed with indigo dyes. Most famous are what? No, my God. blue jeans, knuckleheads, okay? They're workers' clothes, okay? So you dye them with a relatively cheap but very powerful dye, and okay, they're blue instead of white or brown or whatever. Okay. Now, the last that we need to kind of talk about is Georgia. This right here. Okay. Now, at the beginning, Georgia is this little sliver right here. Okay. Now, right on the eve of the Revolution, Georgia actually gets some more territory. There's a reason for that. Okay. It's a war that we'll actually end up talking about here in a few minutes. Okay. But they end up getting a little bit more territory. But in the beginning, they're just this sliver right here. Okay. And Savannah is one of the major cities and the most important harbor. Okay. Georgia, Georgia's a little bit different. Okay. It's a proprietary colony. Okay. It was given to this guy, James Oglethorpe. It's named in honor of King George II. After the death of William and Mary and then their successor, Queen Anne, the English had to go and find monarchs that were related to William and Mary. And the nearest relatives were actually some German princes from a German state in Hanover called Hanover. And they are brought to England and they become the Hanoverian kings, George I, George II, George III. Okay. So, and of course, it's the Hanoverians that are in power when the American Revolution kicks off. So Georgia is named in honor of George. Okay. Founded in 1733, the last of the 13 colonies. All your lives, you've been taught that Georgia was a haven for debtors, for people that were in prison. In Europe, you could be thrown into prison for being in debt. Okay, not for committing murder, mind you, but being in debt. Okay, that's bad. Shoot, I've been in prison a long time ago, if that's the case. Okay, so yes, some of the early population of Georgia were people that were technically prisoners. They were debtors. Okay, they were given a choice: go to prison or come to Georgia. Okay, Oglethorpe kind of saw this as a missionary activity. Okay, and so hey, I'll give you a choice. Okay, you can come to Georgia or you can go to prison. Georgia. Okay. The other thing is that Oglethorpe had this vision that Georgia could become a major agricultural area without the use of slavery. Oglethorpe was not a big fan of slavery, wanted to keep slavery out, but wanted Georgia to become agricultural as well. And he believed that Georgia could, okay, bring in things like wine, silk. Now, you guys have all been to Georgia, okay, or you know where Georgia is. Georgia, Mississippi, Alabama, they're pretty much the same. Hot, okay, tropical. Wine growing, okay. Yeah, boy. Oglethorpe's dream is never going to come to fruition. You will find slavery in Georgia by 1750, so that's only like 17 years after its founding. Okay. The real purpose for Georgia is this: a military buffer zone. Okay. This area down here, okay, East Florida, West Florida, okay, this was Spanish territory. And remember, early on, this Spanish territory reached way up here, okay? So this was Georgia kind of early on. So this area was a hotbed of problems. slaves. Remember where the Stony Rebellion crew trying to get to. Okay? So, unfortunately, the Spanish did not do a very good job of actually policing this area. So it was a hangout for all sorts of ruffians, who tended, by the way, before Georgia was established, to raid into South Carolina, raid into some of these areas, and cause all sorts of trouble. All right, so Georgia really becomes a military outpost. And so the Georgia colony actually was paid by the British government to put people out here along the frontier to give it a military presence. Okay. So in the beginning, Georgia is really a military outpost. Okay. Savannah is a major port. Okay. It's also a very cosmopolitan city, very diverse. Okay. There were lots of different Christian groups that found their way into Savannah, including missionaries who came to work with not only the debtors in Georgia, but also the Indians. Okay. And the most famous was John Wesley. Anybody know who John Wesley is? Wow. Reverend Hall would be very disappointed in y'all. Okay. The Wesley brothers are the founders of Methodism. Okay. So the United Methodist Church traces its origins to the works of the Wesley brothers, including John. Very disappointing. All right. Here's the deal. Okay. No matter what we've talked about, remember that the English colonies are very diverse. We think of them as what? It's one big blob, right? And they're all the same, and they're not. They are 13 different entities dealing with 13 different things, okay? Different environments, different economies, different governments even, okay? Different ways of life. The agricultural way of life in the South, very different from what the Pilgrims and the Puritans were experiencing in New England, right? Very different. You could be treated very differently in each of these colonies, okay? The Savannah Indians, for example, in Georgia and the Carolinas, were used by those early landowners to try to go out and round up other Native Americans to use them for labor supply. Well, we all know from the Columbian Exchange what happens when Native Americans came into contact with Europeans. 9 out of 10 are probably going to die, right? And so the Savannah Indians had had enough of it, and they tried to get out of Carolinas and go to Pennsylvania. Why did they want to go to Pennsylvania? Because the Pennsylvanians and William Penn were much more tolerant and treated the Native Americans fairly. So, but before the Savannah Indians could really get out of town, could get out of the Carolinas, the Carolinians made war on them and almost killed all of them. Okay, so you could be treated very differently, okay, depending on where you were in the colony. Slavery is going to exist in the South. Slavery is going to exist in the North, but at two different extremes. Very few slaves, but there are slaves in New England. There are slaves in every part of the American colonies. But the further north you go, the less you see of it, because it's not economically feasible. But you get to the South, why does slavery have to exist in the South? Okay? Because why? Agriculture. Okay? Agriculture. Okay. We're at a point now where we're going to kind of leave these guys behind for a second. Okay. We're going to move over here and talk about the French for a second. Okay. Because when you look at this map here, okay, you guys, we've talked about the Spanish presence here in North America. Here are the English colonies right up here. But this big blob right here in 1700 is French territory. Now, why haven't we mentioned this? How can this whole big green blob out here be occupied by the French and we haven't talked about it? How many French people do you think are out there? What do you think if you had to do a survey? What are the most densely populated areas in the New World at this particular time? Is it the English colonies, the Spanish colonies, or the French colonies? The English. The English have emphasized and have pumped settlers into these areas for economic purposes, for religious purposes, whatever the reason. There are people that have come over here and they've flocked over here, thousands and thousands and thousands, right? Most of the Spanish population and presence is further south. Okay, when you get out here, it's a freaking desert, remember? Okay, there's not a whole lot of people out there. And this is huge. And the other thing you have to understand about the French did this very differently. Okay, the French did not emphasize settlement. Okay, they explored, they tried to figure out what was over here. They actually did a great job of improving relations between themselves and the Native Americans. They did a great job of building relations between themselves and the Native Americans because they did that for trade, especially fur trade. Okay? They did a great job at that. But what they did not do is pump people over here. Most of the French people that were out here, they are frontiersmen. Okay? They are, in French, they're called coureurs de bois. Okay? They are boatmen. They are on the rivers. They are working with the Native Americans. They are fur trappers. Okay? And there's not that terribly many of them. Now, the French have explored this area. They've explored all of this area. They have established actually some pretty big cities. Okay? Quebec in 1608, Montreal in 1642. But in the rest of this, there's not that many French people out here. Okay? The French have fortified some areas. Okay? For example, by 1718, they had fortified New Orleans. Okay? And Louisiana was part of that French area. They had started to fan out into the Ohio River in Illinois and in other places. Okay? Kaskaskia, Cahokia, Vincennes. Okay? So if you look at this map, okay, out here in this Illinois country right out here, you can see them fanning out into that area between the Mississippi River and the Ohio River. Excellent fishing off Newfoundland and Nova Scotia. Fur trade was lucrative. But the French don't have a major presence here in North America. All these little red dots you see out here, okay, are French trading posts, okay? So they are scattered up and down the rivers, around the Great Lakes. the major waterways, okay? So you can see how important the waterways and fur was. Okay, this is where the fur trade is going on. Okay, those furs will be taken from North America, shipped back to Europe, turned into finished goods, sold all over Europe for enormous profits. Okay, the fur trade's a big deal. Beaver pelts were turned into hats. Okay, foxes and other things turned into coats and garments. Okay, so the fur trade was a massive form of economics or economic wealth for the French. Okay. All right. I told you guys about George the First, George the Second, George the Third. That kind of gives you where we are. Okay. Well, let's talk about this real quick. Everybody see up there where it says George the First, 1714, 1727, and then George the Second, 1727, 1716. And George the Third, who is king or during the American Revolution. What's that mean? Salutary. What's that mean? Go back to the beginning. And I told you guys about the purpose of colonies. Remember that word mercantilism I threw out there? That colonies were part of a bigger thing. Okay? Countries in Europe wanted to strengthen their economies. Excuse me, they wanted to become economically independent because there were a lot of wars going on in Europe. And so they felt like the best thing they could do is increase the holdings of gold and silver, become self-sufficient, get raw materials cheaply. One of the ways you can do that is establish colonies. So the colonies were part of a bigger sphere, right? Here in North America, as early as the 1650s, Parliament passed a series of laws called the Navigation Act. Okay? They've been on the books since the 1650s. The Navigation Act simply said, okay, that the American colonists had to trade with England, only with England, on English ships, with English crews. They could only buy goods from England. They could only sell goods to England. Okay? So they put these laws on the books. Laws are only as good as enforcement. Okay? Best example, the speed limit. Okay? If the law says you're only supposed to go 60 down Highway 18, you're only supposed to go 70 on I-20. You all go 147. Okay? And nobody says anything until what? There's somebody there to enforce it. So what do you think salutary neglect is? It tells you up there. Under the head of areas, what happened? Instead of enforcing those, okay, the English get distracted. They're like an absent parent. Okay? You're in school all day. Your parent has to work third shift and is gone all night. So who's there to oversee you? Nobody. Now you can be a responsible adult, okay? Do the stuff you're supposed to do, go do your homework, okay? Clean the dishes, feed yourself, go to bed on time, get up in the morning, get yourself going. Okay? You can be responsible, or you can go to hell in a handbasket in a hurry, right? There's nobody to guide you. Right. If the British are distracted, then we are at time. Okay? We can test our boundaries. We can do things that we probably shouldn't revenue. I go 147. Okay. We can trade with the Spanish. We can trade with the French. Okay. Nobody has to know about that because there's nobody there to enforce it. So the question is, why would the English not enforce this? The answer is that war. Starting in the late 1600s and going all the way up to, we're going to actually go to right here, okay? There are major colonial wars, okay, that get us all the way up here to the French and Indian War, okay, or the 7 Years' War back in Europe. And so if you really want to push it, okay, Europe is at war in some way or another for pretty much this entire century, from 1688 all the way until 1730. Okay? And then the French Revolution, and Europe back at war again. Okay? So this period of time is full of conflict. All of those wars that you see up there, okay, the War of the League of Augsburg, the War of Spanish Succession, the War of Austrian Succession, the 7 Years' War, all of them are fought in Europe and here in America. In Europe, take a wild guess. Who's usually fighting who? The French versus the English. Why is that? Do they just not like each other? Pretty much. But there's a reason for that. Okay. If you guys were taking if you were taking World Civ or Western Civ, in the second part of that, you talk about the two major governmental systems in Europe at this time. Okay, they've both developed by this time. Okay, one is called absolute monarchy. Okay, in 1660 in France, Louis XIV, he can rule by himself in 1660. He's actually been ruling technically since the 1640s, but he is old enough in 1660 to rule for himself, and he will rule all the way until 1713 or so, 1714 when he dies. Louis is the best example of absolute monarchy. Absolute monarchy is really simple. Okay, absolute means what? All, total, complete. Okay, so anything that has to do with the government under an absolute monarch is the responsibility of the king. Who does he share power with? Nobody. Absolute monarchy is the most efficient form of government possible. It's extremely efficient because there's one person making all the decisions, right or wrong. Okay? I love absolute monarchy as long as I'm the absolute monarch. Okay? I don't want any of you people to be the absolute monarch. A disaster. Okay? I want you to listen to me, not the other way around. The king has total power over the economy. He can tax, he can spend, he can do whatever he wants to. He has complete authority over the law. Okay? So I'm ticked off this morning, okay? And I tell you, I come in and I've got to give this lecture, and I'm really in a bad mood, and my sinuses are hurting. And I say, okay, you guys have made me mad. Anybody that's wearing a black mask, you're going to jail. And if I'm the absolute monarch, then what? The soldiers go march over there and grab all three of you and off you go. Okay? Is that fair? No. Does it matter? No. If you really made me mad, I'll cut your head off. Okay? Because the king can do that. or throw you in prison. The king also has total control over the military, but he has total control over foreign policy. So, if I don't like this room, okay, and I want the big conference room down the hall, okay, and somebody else has control of that, well, he's going to pick it up. Okay. The military, the military, like, king says so, what do we do? Off we go. All right. So, if Louis is absolute, and he is, okay, that means that foreign policy wise, he can do anything he wants, including start 2 of these major wars, which he does. During Louis's reign, France actually fights 4 major wars. 2 with their neighbors, the Dutch, with the Netherlands, okay, where really Louis tries to take over the Netherlands. He fails both times. Makes a huge enemy out of William of Orange, who ends up becoming William III, King of England. So if you look up there, the War of the League of Augsburg is also called here in the colonies what? King William's War, because he is the King of England at that time. Okay. In Europe, it is France and her allies against England and her allies. But these European wars start to spill over here in the colonies, because there are French here and there are English here. And so they start to fight with one another. Every time, by the way. We'll go back to this map here. Every time. Especially early on. We try to take over Quebec and Montreal. Okay? And it's usually a disaster. Okay? That's really the extent of a lot of the fighting here in the colonies early on. Okay? The War of Spanish Succession. 1701 to 1713 is a major war in Europe. All right. I don't want this to turn into a European history project, but you need to know a little bit of the background. It's called the War of Spanish Succession because the Spanish king was dying and he had no heir, which meant that the Spanish throne was essentially up for grabs. Okay. One claimant was Louis XIV's grandson, okay, who had a legitimate claim. Okay. But as soon as that became really possible or feasible, the rest of Europe panicked. Why? And they would upset the balance of power. It would make France a superpower. And that meant everybody else would be in trouble. And so England put together a group, okay, who did not support Louis's claim, okay, the French claim. They actually came up with their own claimant, okay, and they fight a war over it for over 10 years. I told you guys that Louis technically fought 4 major wars. Okay. He probably goes 0-3-1. Okay. He ties this one maybe. Because after 13 years of fighting, at the Peace of Utrecht, okay, at the end of the war comes, and they negotiate a treaty. And Louis's grandson does become the King of Spain. Today, the present day kings of Spain are descendants of the Bourbon family, which is the ruling family of France. So technically, Louis gets his side of the family onto the throne of Spain. But the powers insist, and Louis agrees, that the two thrones can never be united. You can never have a king of France and Spain. Okay? They could never be united. Now, of course, they can be allies, but they can't be united. The other thing that happens is that England gets some territory right off the coast of Spain, a place called Gibraltar. It's actually the southern tip of Spain, okay? And it guards the Strait of Gibraltar, which is the major entranceway and exit point to the Mediterranean. Who still controls Gibraltar today? England does, okay? So if you go to Spain and you cross over into Gibraltar, you're actually crossing over into English territory, even though it's Spain. Why do you think the English keep it? It's a choke point. It's a major geographic choke point. It's one of the two entrances and exits to the Mediterranean. One is the Strait of Gibraltar. What's the other one? It's an artificial one. None of you are any good at Stratego or taking over the world, right? Suez Canal. Okay. So that's the only way you can get into or get out of the Mediterranean Sea. So of course the British still want it, right? Because it's a strategic point. And they get that because of the War of Spanish Succession. Louis dies, though, shortly after the War of Spanish Succession, essentially having bankrupted France. You fight 4 major wars, you tend to do that. Okay? And so Louis' successors, Louis XV and Louis XVI, both have to deal with problems as a result of that. When you get to right here, and the French Revolution breaks out in 1789, what do you think the major cause of the French Revolution is? Yeah, economic problems that France can't or won't solve, left over from Louis XIV. Okay? But in the meantime, there are some other wars, okay, including the War of Austrian Succession. And then you get to this one, okay? You get to this 7 Years' War, French and Indian War, and it is a little bit different. It's a lot different. For example, you look over here, 7 Years' War in Europe began in 1756. But the colonial war that we call the French and Indian War starts in 1754. I should give you a clue. Where does the French and Indian War start? Here. It starts here. And so we got to figure out why. Okay. And the answer, you go back to this map again. Okay. After 1713, okay, when France had really struggled, one of the things that the French started to do is realize we gotta start protecting what's ours. The English are very strong. They've beaten us. And so we've got to start fortifying these areas if we want to keep them. And so the French began to increase their military presence here in America. They began to increase their military presence in their colonies. And one of the things they started to do is to build forts out along the frontier here in the Ohio River Valley. Now, while they start to do that, these British colonies are trying to do what? Expand this way. And so, if they're starting to run up amongst each other, what do you think is going to happen? They're eventually going to start shooting at one another. And that's exactly how you start a war. Okay? And so, as the French began to fortify a lot of these areas, okay, as they start to fortify these areas right out here, okay, all you need is a flashpoint, okay, to start having All right, some major issues, okay? We get it. All right, this is the map in about 1750 or so. You have the English colonies, the British colonies here, you have all this French area out here, and all this area right out here is kind of in dispute. Because the English are trying to push out this way, the French are trying to fortify these areas, especially this area on the river valley here. And so all you need is some dummy to go out here and start traipsing around and start a war. And we get it. Who's the dummy? None of you know. Golly. A young, well, he's pretty young by that time, Virginia military officer named George Washington. Poor old George is sent out here with a survey crew, essentially, to start surveying some of these areas because Virginia wants to expand into these areas. And so George goes staggering out here. And look, by the way, guys, okay, this is virgin forest, and by staggering, I mean staggering, okay? This area is tough, hard, okay? No roads. So there are a lot of stuff that can go wrong. And when George gets out into this area with his surveyors and a few soldiers that he has, he sees the French building a fort. Okay? The French are going to call it Fort Duquesne. I know, it looks like Fort Duquesne. Okay? Trust me, it's Fort Duquesne. Okay? I learned to speak French. Okay? It is at the point where the Monongahela and the Allegheny River come together to form the Ohio River. Anybody know where that is today? That's exactly right. Okay? Because there used to be a stadium right there called Three River Stadium, the old place where the Pittsburgh Steelers used to play. It's now Heinz Field, whatever, and I'm naming rights. But where the Monongahela and the Allegheny come together to form the Ohio, that's Pittsburgh. Okay? So the French are out there fortifying this area. Well, George comes staggering out there, and he's like, wait a minute, what y'all doing? You can't do that. The French take George into the fort, feed him, and then politely tell him to get out or we're going to kill you. Okay. And of course, George's like, you can't do that. Okay. And he will retreat. Okay. So, Fort Duquesne's right up here. Okay. So Washington actually sort of retreats a few miles down the river here and starts building his own fort, Fort Necessity. You can probably guess why he called it that, because he had to build it out of necessity. He gets attacked and will eventually have to retreat back into Virginia. Now, when he gets back into Virginia, he goes and gives his report to the Virginia governor. And the Virginia governor is like, well, I can't do that. And so he goes and gives his report to the British. And the British government says, well, I can't do that. And so the British decide to send a military expedition out here to see what's really going on. Okay? Who knows? These wahoo backwoods Americans, they don't know what they're doing anyway. Okay? So let the British take control. Okay? And so the British decide to send a military presence here into America. Okay? And they choose this guy, Braddock. Now, Braddock had already kind of made a name for himself. Newfoundland and Nova Scotia, forced them out. Now they say, look, we want you to come and boot these guys out of the Ohio River Valley. And so Braddock is going to take a force, okay, into this area. I'm going to find the map here, okay. So, Virginia, you guys know, is right here. Okay? And so Braddock is going to push his way right up here, okay, towards where Fort Necessity was. Okay? And then he's going to push his way out to where Fort Duquesne. Now, Braddock is a European guy. He has no idea how to fight in these conditions. He's hauling artillery, which is slow. He's having to cut a road essentially as he goes, which is slow. Okay. He's making all kinds of noise. Okay. Washington is with him. Washington is the only one that really knows where these guys are. And Washington is steadily telling him, you're going to get us killed. You're going to get us killed. You're going to get us killed. You're going to get us ambushed. We're going to die. Okay? Take a wild guess when Braddock gets close enough to where the French actually decide that they got to go after him. What do you think happens? Braddock walks right into an ambush. The French and their Native American allies take up positions where the artillery does them no good. Okay? So they've been hauling this artillery. You can't shoot artillery in the middle of the forest. So they've been building this road. And a lot of times when you build roads, you don't take the high ground, you go the easiest way, right? And so they've left the high ground to their enemies, which then ambush them, and they're getting killed left and right. Washington has, I think, 2, maybe 3 horses shot out from under him. He has bullet holes all through his coat. He could have been killed here. We'll talk about how the world changes. What if Washington gets killed here? Okay, does the American Revolution happen? Is the American Revolution successful? So if any of you invent the time machine, you want to really screw with things, get Washington killed here and see what happens. Okay? Braddock is shot, mortally wounded. He's going to die, but he is wounded severely. When he's wounded, Washington takes over, organizes a retreat, and gets them out of it. Braddock dies on the retreat, and they pause just long enough to dig a hole in the middle of the road that they cut on their way in, bury Braddock's body in the road, and then walk over him to disguise it so that they wouldn't dig his body up and desecrate it. This starts what we here in America call French and Indian War. It's a tough time because it makes it sound like the French fighting the Indians, right? And that's not what happened. It's the French and the Indians against who? The British and the American colonists. So it's the French and Indian War, 1754 to 1763. Okay, we started. Now the British are going to finish it. Okay, because it also breaks out back in Europe. It turns into the 7 Years' War back in Europe. For us, though, look at what I told you. Every time there's a colonial war, what do we try to do? Look where some of the fighting is. Montreal and Quebec, right? So that's always going to be, most of the fighting actually takes place in Canada. There is some fighting out here. Okay, there's some fighting out here along the Great Lakes. Okay. But most of the fighting is actually right up here in by the border between New York in Canada, and then up towards Quebec and Montreal. All right, so that's where most of the fighting takes place. The war, you guys don't necessarily understand how important this war is unless, by the way, that's Braddock. Braddock. Poor guy. What a dummy. All right, where's our wonderful map here? Here we go. I know I've got it. There we go. This is North America in 1763. What's missing? Where's the French territory at? So it's pretty easy to figure out who loses, right? In 1763, at the end of the war, the French lose everything. Okay? They lose everything. The only thing they have left is a little piece of what is today Haiti. Okay? That's all they have left in North America. They have lost all their colonial possessions. The British and the Spanish technically are the big winners. Okay? Now, do you remember me telling you earlier on that the British have done a poor job of administering the colonies because of all this warfare? When you get gains like this, when you now control all of Canada, all of America up into the Mississippi River, as a result of you winning the French and Indian War, can you afford to not pay attention to this area anymore? These are huge wins, huge gains. You've got to start paying attention to this. Why do the English have to pay attention to it? Number one, they're broke. They have been fighting just as many wars as the French have, and they're broke. So what do they not want to have happen anytime soon? Another war. And so they're going to kind of have to become a parent again. All right. We'll kind of leave you with this. You've been with that absentee parent for years, where you've been taking care of yourself. You've been doing the things that you have to do. Okay. You've made it through high school. You've gotten scholarships. Okay. You've worked. You've saved up your money. You've got all your financial aid in order. Okay. You've got everything ready. You may have even saved up enough money to buy your car. And you've done it all on your own. Okay. Then all of a sudden, that absentee parent shifts jobs, is back on the same schedule with you. And they start to pay attention to some of the choices that you're making and some of the things that you're doing. They're like, whoa, wait a minute. You can't go there. I don't care what kind of scholarship and your room and board you got. You're not going there. You're going to go here. What are you going to do? You're going to have a serious issue with that, right? Where were you when I was doing all this on my own? Where were you when I made these decisions based on what I thought was best for me because you weren't here? And then all of a sudden, you come back into my life and tell me that I can't do this and I can't do that. That is not going to go well. And you know it's not. So all of a sudden, when the British show back up in our lives after the French and Indian War and say, hey, you guys, We want you to trade only with us. That was the law. We're going to enforce it. We also aren't going to let you settle anywhere past this line. That's the Royal Proclamation Law of 1763 right there. Okay. We aren't going to let you settle anywhere past this line. Why? Because you go out there, you're going to run into, say, Native Americans, you're going to run into some French who haven't evacuated, and you guys are going to start another war, which we can't afford because we always have to bail you out. So no settling west of that line. So you're going to start trading with us, only with us, buying our goods, sending us your raw materials, staying where we tell you to. Oh, and by the way, you are going to have to pay for some of your defense, some of the cost of your own defense. How can a country get you to pay for things? How do we pay for our military today? How do we pay for those billions and billions of dollars that it costs to build an F-35 or a gigantic aircraft carrier or a big old M1 Abrams tank? How do we do that? Taxes. So for the first time, the British are going to look at the American colonists and say, not only are you going to do all these things, but you're going to help pay for some of them too. And you guys can guess what happens next. Okay. All right, we're going to stop here. Okay. I am going to, over the next day, probably tomorrow, put up some instructions about what we're going to do for our first test. Okay. For you guys, it's going to be a little bit different. Okay. The other class is actually going to have to do some things, but for you guys, it's going to be a little bit different. Okay. And we're probably not going to test in class. I'm going to let you kind of test on your own with, the way that things are going. We don't want to pass around too much paper and all that